So I'm going to, this is bad news for you, but you have freedom of movement, I hope. Well, that way I'm at least out of the way for most people.
Good, I have a great view, thank you.
You do? Okay, well that's...
Bustani is with an I. It's just I have to speak to the family, personal friends, but otherwise it's okay.
This is not a good start.
It's the same name, doesn't change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to rattle through this. I'm going to assume, and I've been told to assume that some of you know quite a lot, but the rest of you know nothing at all, so I will, which is probably unfair to everyone, but I'm going to assume not a great deal of knowledge about the ins and outs of the Tunisian revolution. So I'm going to give you my take. I'm not, by the way, let me preface this with a get-out clause. I certainly don't regard myself as an authority on Tunisia. I'm a specialist on North Africa, but have been watching Tunisia really out of the corner of my eye for years, rather than really focusing intently on it while looking at Egypt and Algeria above all. But now, I'd like to extend this bit. That's it. That's better. That's right. Okay. This is a sort of preliminary statement of the problematic. I was in Tunisia last summer. I decided it was time I had a look and tried to figure out for myself what's going on. I have a very positive view of the Tunisian story, though I'm still anxious for Tunisia. I don't think that the transition is completed at all. I think that it could run into serious difficulties in the next couple of years. But I'm still, on the whole, optimistic. In my view, this is the only real revolution to have occurred in the so-called Arab Spring. I don't take seriously the claims for revolutions elsewhere. And I think it's really interesting how and why the Tunisians managed to develop an initial spasm of unrest into a revolution. The revolution in question is, in my view, above all, a transition to constitutional government. And I think that would be a blessing for the region as a whole, and I think that the other societies have an interest in understanding what has been going on in Tunisia and how the Tunisians have managed what they've brought off so far. In my view, I'm mostly going to be talking about what's happened up until now. My basic take is that for reasons we'll go into, the Tunisians have succeeded in navigating very difficult waters and are in a reasonably good position in terms of sorting out their governing arrangements, although there's still a lot of development to occur, and it could go wrong. But that they're now facing a new challenge, and that challenge is, to cut to the chase, precisely the issue that they've been ignoring for the last 4 years, which is the issue that actually underlay the original uprising, namely the extreme socioeconomic distress of that part of Tunisia that doesn't recognize itself when it looks at the political class. We have two Tunisias. As people are well aware, there are at least two Egypts and probably two Algerias, and there are two Tunisias, and this will come out in the analysis to follow. And that now that provisional agreement has been reached, and of course all agreements in politics are temporary and provisional and conditional and will unravel before long, following the election of a new legislature last autumn, followed by the election of the President of the Republic, and the constitution recently, this month, in February, of a new government that's a coalition government. They can't any longer allow themselves to be diverted from the challenge of socioeconomic policy. And so the big question is, can they rise to that challenge? And it's by no means obvious that they can. And that's really where I intend to end. So I now intend to follow a path that brings me back to that point by looking at I'm going backwards, sorry, I don't want to do that. Okay. The revolution differed from its neighbors because it irrevocably changed the form of government of the state. And it did that because the state, the central element of the form of government of the state was a genuine ruling party, however much in decay, as all one-party states do eventually decay and become corrupt. And not only did they overthrow Ben Ali, but they abolished the ruling party. and it was a real party. And perhaps I should just take a second to explain that when the Tunisians abolished the RCD, the rally, the Democratic Constitutional Rally, they were doing something different from what the Egyptians were doing when they torched the offices of the NDP in Cairo. Because the NDP in Cairo was not where power lay. It was never the party that decided who was president. It was never the party that made policy. But the party in Tunisia was the source of power. And in a way that in Egypt it never was, and in Algeria it's never been. And to abolish the source of power was to enter the unknown. That's the way I read it at the time. And it meant that the Tunisians had to show themselves to be resourceful and innovative in constitutional matters. And it seems to me, on the whole, they've done reasonably well so far. I'm inclined to say very well. That's why I consider it to have been a real revolution, in the sense of a real political revolution, a genuine transition out of one constitutional framework, and the attempt, so far successful, to construct a new one. That never happened in Egypt, in my view, and hasn't happened that I've noticed anywhere else. Maybe I've missed something. Now, I'm going to talk about how this developed, and then a bit about how the Islamists behaved in power, and then about the ensuing crisis and how that crisis was resolved, and then the elections that took place recently, and the new configuration in power. And then look at what they have to confront the economic situation. I'm going to get these buttons wrong. I imagine you're all familiar with how the story began, the suicidal gesture of Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor who couldn't stand the humiliation he was subjected to any longer and set himself on fire in the little town of Sidi Bouzid, which is there in the middle of the country. And in the geographical center actually means it's way out on the socioeconomic periphery and cultural periphery. La Tunisie utile, the prosperous and developed part of Tunisia, is effectively the northeast, down to about here. And the rest is, that's the core, socioeconomically speaking, and the rest is periphery. And Bouazizi was a desperate young man on the periphery. And he died on the 4th of January 2011. I'm going backwards again, damn. A second, that's how it began. It began as a gesture of anger and despair, and locals demonstrated their concern, but that isn't why the revolution occurred. The revolution occurred because what then developed is a centripetal dynamic that had several elements. The first element is that elements of, if you like, the developed Tunisia began to get involved in the protests, and the most important elements getting involved were the trade unions. And they helped to develop the protests into politically purposeful demonstrations. And the second point is that subsequently, of course, wider elements of the intelligentsia backed the protests. They had a centripetal dynamic insofar as they came in from the periphery to the core. At the time this was happening, in early January 2011, demonstrations in Algeria were behaving in exactly the opposite way, a centrifugal dynamic starting in the cities and then dispersing all over the country like rivers running down into the Sahara and ending up with nothing. So we have this interesting centripetal dynamic with civil society getting involved and giving purpose and fresh content to the demonstrations. We have an army that refuses, in its moment of truth, to defend Ben Ali. This is the chief of staff who told Ben Ali the day before he fell, "I agree to deploy soldiers, but the army does not shoot the people." And that reflected the historic relationship between the army and the ruling party. The army saw itself as, in a way, the poor relation of the ruling party and resented it and was not going to step in to save Ben Ali. And this is a difference between the army in Tunisia and in, for example, Egypt or Algeria. It was not the source of power. It did not consider it had a huge stake in the status quo and acted accordingly. We then had, this is the standard slogan, use Ben Ali dégage, and this was the scene on the 14th of January in central Tunis, the day Ben Ali finally clears off. We then have a situation of provisional governments, of elements of the established regime carrying on. Mohamed Ranouchi thinks he can be president briefly, but he's disabused of that a day later and is succeeded as president by Fouad Mabaza, who remains as caretaker for some time. And in the meantime, the next crucial step is taken, the dissolution of the ruling party on March the 9th. That is the moment where it seems to me a revolution is really happening, that it's not simply a question of Ben Ali going, but of a change in the form of government, a constitutional change. We then have a new government under this old stalwart of the old regime, Beji Caïd Essebsi, pending elections. And elections are initially scheduled for July, but eventually postponed till the autumn. And in the meantime, the Islamists have time to organize. And as you're probably well aware, Tunisia's Islamists have been led by Rachid Ranouchi for a long time. He's been in exile in London for a long time. He came back in 2011, and his party was legalized and went on to perform very well in the elections. And this was the initial outcome. I don't know whether you can see the figures. Ennahda emerging as the largest party with 37% of the votes cast, 89 of the seats, which was not a majority. You had, but the significant thing about this was that it was streets ahead of all the other parties. You had Ennahda way out there ahead on its own, and then a scattering of four parties with between 29 and 16 seats, and then a long tail of tiny parties with a few seats and independents. And this meant that the electoral or the party political lineup was one that was not conducive to stable democracy at all. But it was a situation that obliged Ennahda to govern, because the agreement underlying the elections for the Constituent Assembly was that the Assembly would not only draw up a constitution, but it would also be empowered to appoint a government. And Ennahda, therefore, was virtually obliged to agree to form a government, which it did in an alliance, I'm going backwards again, with two other parties, the party of Monsef Marzouki, the leader of a party called the Congress for the Republic, who is elected president of the Republic in December, and a smaller left-wing party called Etatakol. If we go back to, I'm very bad at manipulating this, if we go back to the previous, Congress for the Republic came second, and the fourth party here is Etakatol, which came fourth with 20 seats. They have an overall majority as a coalition. Now, that's the initial setup with Marzouki. He was not an Islamist in the presidency, somebody with a very honorable track record as a defender of human rights and as being, if anything, a kind of moderate leftist. We have the Islamists as prime minister, succeeded subsequently by another Islamist. I've misspelt his name here, but never mind. And then in the course of 2012, things become very difficult, and even more difficult in 2013. The Ennahda government, or Ennahda-dominated government, is bitterly resented by elements of the secular left. The question of the constitution is not resolved. In other words, much the same argument is going on in Tunisia as went on in Egypt over the question of the constitution, the question of an Islamic versus a more secular constitution, excuse me. And in particular in Tunisia, this was particularly acute given the modernist tradition inherited from the Bourguiba and Ben Ali regimes of Tunisian nationalism, which was not strictly speaking secular, but as secular as you can really make it, given the obligation to recognize Islam as the religion of the state. Tunisia was never a secular state. In its 1959 constitution, it actually calls itself the Islamic Republic of Tunisia, something which most people seem to forget. But of course, the actual policy of the Neo-Destor, as it was originally called, subsequently the Destorian Socialist Party, and then the Constitutional Democratic Rally, the idea of constitutionalism being a permanent fixture in the name, Destor, Destorien, Constitutionnel, was very much influenced by French conceptions of political modernity, including the secular dimension, and pro-gender equality. Bourguiba was particularly notable for his the policies favoring women that he took. So there were what many Tunisians considered to be acquis, long-established gains of the previous period that were potentially under threat from an Islamist government, and this made the constitution a very, very redoubtable bone of contention. It made a large element of the intelligentsia extremely suspicious of Ennahda in respect of its intentions. And at the same time, we had the development alongside Ennahda that had a tradition of being, I don't like the word moderate, of being, if you like, Islamic modernist. If one wants to consider where Ennahda comes from, it certainly comes from what I can think of as the Islamic modernist strand in contemporary Islamism. It considers itself to be, in that sense, an offshoot of the original Salafiyya movement. It would cite people like Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu and so on as old intellectual lights by which it guides itself. In the writings of Ghanouchi, it's adapted to modern Western notions of democracy a long time ago, at least verbally. And of course, there's always this argument whether they can be trusted. But the point is that it is not to be confused with the brand of Islamism demonstrated by the contemporary Salafiyya movement, which is, of course, very largely influenced by Wahhabi teaching and is fundamentalist in the strict sense of the term. That's to say, believing in the literal inerrancy of Scripture. That isn't the outlook of Ennahda at all. It's much more in the tradition of Abdu and the emphasis on ijtihad in matters of law and so forth. Now, these distinctions are clearly not observed by elements of the secular left, and secularism in Tunisia, as in Egypt and in Algeria, is a kind of identity. And so there was always an element of the left that was going to be very hostile to Ennahda and regard the Ennahda government as illegitimate, more or less whatever it said and did. The situation was very much aggravated by the extent to which a Wahhabi-style Salafi movement develops in Tunisia, outflanking the Ennahda authorities on their Islamic flank in a way that is that provokes a great deal of controversy and creates a Tunisian instance of the problem that actually the Morsi presidency in Egypt also had to face. How does a non-Salafi, non-fundamentalist, modernist Islamist party in power navigate when it's being outflanked by fundamentalists who, in many cases, are engaging in violent activity, even if not jihadis, but engaging in strong-arm tactics, in controversial resorts to incidental violence, and in particular, rhetoric and arguments that will raise the hackles of any secularist, and negotiate at the same time with people on its secular flank. This was the strategic dilemma of Ennahda, and this was made more acute by the development of jihadi activity, of terrorism, which had always been really rather, sorry, I'm going too fast, slight in Tunisia by comparison with Algeria. Tunisia, for a very, very long time, seemed to be effectively insulated from the activities of jihadi movements in Algeria and elsewhere in the Maghreb. But this has changed since 2011. And matters came to a head in the course of 2013 when this man was assassinated. Chokri Belaid was a leftist, a leader of the popular movement, which only won 2 seats in October 2011, but was nonetheless a respected and prominent figure on the Tunisian left. And he was assassinated in Tunis on February the 6th, 2013. This was one of the slogans that was used at the time. It may ring a bell. And this was a major sensational event. And it was exploited by some secularists against Ennahda. And the point here was Ennahda was accused of being either morally responsible or, in fact, in some degree, complicit with the Salafis that were assumed to be behind this. And the difficulty, it seems to me, that Ennahda was in was that it actually had a strategy of trying to avoid repressing the non-violent Salafis. The jihadis were another matter, but the non-violent Salafis, it regarded, it had a difficulty with it. Its policy was not to resort to repression, but to argue with them, partly because at its own base, in its own rank and file, there were elements of its own movement that would see no real difference between the Ennahda position and the Salafi position on various points. And that was a problem that also arose in the Egyptian context. And as a result, it had a strategy of trying to wean the Salafis, at least some of the Salafis, away from their more extreme positions. And this gave the appearance of being complicit. So we have this initial sensational event that has destabilizing implications. It brings to the fore and renders acute and raises the temperature the identity question. Islamism, secularism, the identity of Tunisia, the future identity of Tunisia, given that at this juncture the constitution remains to be determined, that whole debate on the constitution is nowhere near being concluded. And as if that wasn't enough, we have a repeat in the summer. Another prominent left-wing figure associated with a secular position, I don't know why I can't reach this button, is assassinated at the end of July. And this raises the temperature even further. And at this point, I have to say, I had real fear for the Tunisian revolution. I thought that there was clearly, it seemed to me, a plan to destabilize it. And this destabilization was going to continue until it succeeded. And part of the, if you like, the story, one might even say the miracle of Tunisia, is that the forces in Tunisia that were committed to a democratic transition managed to prevent the destabilization going any further at that point. And I think that what they did at that point was absolutely crucial. And in a way, it's the central element of what I regard as a really rather cheering and uplifting story. What happens is that the prospect of further destabilization is headed off by an intervention of elements of the political class and, above all, elements of civil society. Let me talk about the political class first. And this is where we bring back Beji Caid Essebsi, who had briefly been prime minister, as you recall, in the early months after the overthrow of Ben Ali, and then had faded. He's a stalwart of the old order. He was a prominent fixture in the RCD regime, not someone personally associated with either corruption or repression. So somebody with a relatively clean shield, as the communists used to say in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. A relatively clean slate. No one has attacked him for his previous behavior. But he's definitely associated with the past. He's very elderly, born in 1926. He's now 88, and he's now president. He establishes this new party called Nida Tunis, Call for Tunisia. And this party is initially seen as a receptacle for the old RCD, as the old political elite making a comeback. And my view is that that is a very one-dimensional view of it. First, because it's not limited simply to ex-veterans of the RCD. It also includes people from other political points of view, including people of a social democratic background and outlook. So it's a mistake simply to see it as the return of the deep state or whatever, or the Falul, as they would be called in Egypt, the people of the old regime. In my view, its positive significance is that it provides a political party receptacle for anti-Nahda sentiment that is a political party and that isn't extreme in its own outlook. It is secular. This is a non-Islamist political party with a future. If you go back to if we look, just refresh our memory about the election results in October 2011, Ennahda is way out ahead. It has no rivals. The point about Nida Tunis is that it addresses that imbalance. It creates a political party that is able to rally people from a range of points of view around a core of actually really rather experienced and skillful political figures, experienced precisely because they are people from the RCD era, who are able to build a party capable of rivaling Ennahda in the electoral sphere, and therefore introducing a balance in the party political arena. That is, in my view, a necessary, not perhaps a sufficient, but a necessary condition for heading off indigenous impulses to destabilize the regime by extra-constitutional means. And I think that was important. So the emergence of Nida Tunis, it's founded in 2012, but it becomes prominent in 2013 in the context of this crisis arising out of these two assassinations, is that it offers Ennahda's secular opponents something to rally around within the logic and procedures of democratic party politics. And that's it. That's something that the Egyptians didn't have. That's one of the reasons for popular support for the military intervention in Cairo, was that secular Egyptians saw no party political vehicle with which to challenge the Muslim Brothers. But that's just a passing thought. Okay. We have indeed Tunis beginning to become active in the public arena in 2013. But then we have civil society intervening, and it was the civil society intervention that, in my view, was really decisive. We have the quartet, consisting of Widad Bouchamawi of the Employers Federation, UTICA. This is the Tunisian, literally the Tunisian Union of Industry, Commerce, and Artisanate. It's the main patronat, the main employers association. We have the National Trade Union, the Union Générale Tunisienne du Travail, led by Hussein Abbasi. And then we have the Tunisian League for Human Rights, Abdel Sattar Ben Moussa, and the Lawyers Guild, Mohamed Fadel Mahmoud. And it's the intervention of the quartet that resolves the crisis. And my view of it is that it's really the trade union that matters in this. The strategy followed is that to end the polarization, to counter the polarizing demands, and demands are being raised that would have actually aborted the transition. Not only the demand that the Ennahda government has to go, get out, but that the National Constituent Assembly, which is the body that gave it its mandate, because it's in the Constituent Assembly that it has a plurality with 89 seats, that's where it has its mandate, that the Constituent Assembly should be dissolved. Now, if the Constituent Assembly had been dissolved at that moment, that would have been the abortion of the transition, because no constitution had been agreed. Where would you go from that point? There would have been no sense of direction at all. The quartet, in a sense, sets itself up, and it's set up on the initiative of the UGTT. And the key person here is Hussein Abbasi. And my reading is that he secures the support in a very intelligent way. He's a trade unionist, he's a genuine trade unionist, but he's perfectly prepared to ally himself with the employers in a good cause. And he secures the agreement of UTICA. And then we have the human rights and lawyers being brought in as, in a way, to embroider it a little. That's how I see it, maybe a little cynically. But it's the trade union and the employers' federations that represent major interests in society. And they're intervening to bring a bit of order back into the party political sphere. And what they do is they're determined to preserve the Constituent Assembly. They persuade Ennahda that it has to withdraw from government, but they are conscious that this has to be handled in a way that Ennahda can live with, that Ennahda, in other words, has to be allowed an elegant exit so that it can make a political comeback later. The great mistake is to play a zero-sum game, winner takes all sort of scenario. This is a game that is intended to have no ending, and therefore people should be able to make comebacks, and therefore when they withdraw, they're allowed to withdraw, saving their face. And the quartet understands this, Abbasi understands this. So it's, in a way, a three-point deal. Ennahda will bow to public pressure. It's lost the confidence of too much of the electorate to be able to carry on, so it's time for it to withdraw. But the Constituent Assembly is preserved, and Ennahda's own demand that a date for future elections is agreed before it stands down is met. That's the trade-off. And that's how it works. And it's very much a function of, in my view, the intelligence and wisdom of Ghannouchi. Ghannouchi is a very sophisticated person, capable of subtlety in politics, and knowing when to move forward and when to withdraw. His life is really a kind of alternating between these two different modes. He recognized that the quartet was an opportunity for him to, in a way, cover a retreat. A retreat was necessary. And precisely because it was coming from the quartet, not from party political adversaries. It wasn't coming as a diktat. It was something that he could defer to without loss of face and without loss of standing in the party political game. And it was something that he could sell to his own rank and file. And as you see from this quote, the coalition government will not resign until the national dialogue reaches a consensus agreement that guarantees the completion of the democratic transition and the organization of free and fair elections. We seem not to be able to get the whole of my picture in here. I don't know why. Okay, just give you a little look at this man who I think was the man of the hour. Hossein Abbasi, General Secretary of the UGTT, 60, he's now coming up to, 68. So he's a veteran trade unionist. And the point here, I'd just like to sort of open a bracket, open a parenthesis. There's something really very interesting about the UGTT. It isn't a corporatist trade union. It looked like one for a long time because it came under the hegemony of the ruling party during the one-party period. In the struggle against France, in the national struggle, it was, of course, a crucial ally and relay for Bourguiba's Neo-Destour, the Nationalist Party, up until independence in 1956. But there's a crucial contrast between the UGTT and, for instance, its Algerian counterpart next door. The Algerian trade union, the Union Générale des Travailleurs Algériens, the Algerian Union of, the General Union of Algerian Workers, was actually created by the FLN during the war. It was set up on the initiative of the National Liberation Front and was from the beginning, first and foremost, a relay for the armed struggle, for the revolution. And it never, in a way, transcended that character, that dependent relationship. It was the offspring of the FLN. But the UGTT was not the offspring of the Neo-Destour. The UGT set itself up in 1946 during the French period. It was not created as a satellite of or relay of the Neo-Destour. It was quite independent of the Neo-Destour. And those circumstances of its birth, in my view, have mattered. And the point is that there has long been, in fact, throughout the period, since 46, throughout the period of one-party rule from 56 to 2011, there's always been an element within the outlook of the UGTT that has been critical of and unhappy about its relationship with the ruling party, has accepted this relationship as a necessity of practical politics without being, if you like, spiritually keen on it or ideologically committed to it at all. And we've seen tensions between the UGTT and the ruling government, both under Bourguiba and under Ben Ali, at a number of important instances, notably the general strike in 1978 and so on. My point, therefore, is that this is a national trade union with a difference that has actually had it in it to graduate from the status of an apparent corporatist trade union and is a freely acting force in its own right in civil society. And one of the aspects of this is the extent to which it contains within its membership a variety of brands of politics and manages that diversity. There are active members, active cadres of the UGTT belonging to different parties. And the union handles this with every appearance of aplomb. It's quite different from the UGTA in Algeria and from the Egyptian corporatist union as well. This is a very interesting animal indeed. And my view is that part of my hypothesis is that the specificity of the UGTT is a premise of the ability of its general secretary to intervene in such a decisive and intelligent and effective manner. In the summer of 2013, Hussein Abbasi was basically calling the shots. And Ennahda and Nida Tunis were ending up going along with what he was suggesting, not to mention the employers. The outcome is the deal bears fruit. The constitution is finally agreed in January 2014. Islam remains the religion of the state, nothing new about that. Freedom of belief upheld, and that's important. Equality of men and women. That element is, the modernists are satisfied on that point, they get satisfaction. Attacks on religion are banned, but also accusing people of unbelief is outlawed, and that's an important point. And it's adopted with an overwhelming vote, and it's part of the tacit part of the deal by which persuading Ennahda to back off. And Ennahda does back off. That's the end of the Ennahda government. And an independent non-party government is formed with Mehdi Joma, who I think was in Cambridge recently. I was unable to get there. As an interim caretaker government pending fresh elections. The elections are finally held last October, and Nida Tunis emerges as the leading party. Oh dear, I was afraid this was going to happen. Oh dear, it looked all very nice when I last looked at this, trying to get everything in the right columns. Okay, I will interpret this for you. Nida Tunis emerges as the largest party with 86 seats, 37.5% of the vote. And view and what? Where is full screen? At the bottom. I should have done this before. Marginal improvement, I think. Anyway, Nida Tunis have 86 seats. Ennahda in second place, 69 seats. And they lose. There's a 20% swing against Ennahda. There's a big swing, 25% swing against the second party previously. That's the party of the previous president, Monsef Marzouki. So the elements of the three-party coalition that was led by Ennahda, the Troika as it was known, Ennahda, Congress for the Republic, and also Tatakol, they are badly hit. We have a nouvelle dawn. We have Nida Tunis emerging, clearly the winner, but Ennahda way ahead of the rest of the field. And there is what I regard as a symbolically important moment, Rashid Ghannouchi not waiting to admit defeat, but admitting it early on, very promptly, and immediately congratulating his opponents on their victory. And I see this as an intelligent signal. I understand the rules of the game. I hope the rest of you do. You've won this round. Well done. And we will meet again on another field or on the same field later on. It was an expression, in my view, of his commitment, or at any rate, his wish to be seen as committed to the democratic game of what the French call l'alternance. And I think that some Tunisians, at any rate, will have appreciated that. Okay, that's the legislative elections, but look what it means on the map. Two Tunisians. The red Tunisia is Qaida Sebsi's Nida Tunis. Blue Tunisia voted for Ennahda. It's rather striking, isn't it? Sorry?
It's like the United States.
Well, I think it's even more stark, actually. But, well, they use the same colors, true. In the same peculiar way, speaking as an Englishman, we would reverse the colors used in America, but never mind, that's another matter. All right, we then have the presidential elections in a table that behaves itself for once. The columns are fairly straight this time. And an important point about the presidential election, how much longer do I have, Philip? Do I have another?
You're doing fine. How about another 5 or 10 minutes?
Okay,
And then we'll move
okay,
to questions
sure.
or comments? Yeah.
It's an important fact about the presidential elections that Ennahda announced that it wouldn't contest them. It's known not to make the Egyptians' mistakes. And of course, a point I omitted to mention of the context of the summer of 2013 was, of course, the coup in Cairo between the two assassinations. The coup occurred in Cairo on July the 3rd. Mohammed Brahmi is assassinated on July the 28th. And this is a situation of high drama already because of the Shokri Balad assassination. The Egyptian story, of course, heightens tensions in Tunisia. And then, since the Tunisians are not cracking, there's another assassination. I think there's grounds for suspecting these assassinations, by the way. That's perhaps a story we can come back to. But in any case, we see Ennahda, in advance of the legislative elections, assuring people it won't in any case be contesting the presidency. So it doesn't want to compromise its performance in the legislative elections on the grounds that people would be afraid of it then going for the presidency. And that's, again, politically intelligent. It's thinking out the moves and seeking opportunities to provide assurance. We see the two main candidates are Essebsi, the leader of Nida Tunis, and Marzouki, the incumbent. And there's the figures. Essebsi wins on the runoff quite emphatically, but it's not a crushing win. And he has to stand for a second round, something that de Gaulle resented having to do in 1965. In other words, presidential power is qualified by the fact that it took 2 rounds to elect this president. He's a man of the old regime, so he's suspect in the eyes of many on that grounds, welcome to others as a defender of the secular tradition and so on and so forth. But it takes 2 rounds to get him elected. And so I think that's a reason for being relatively confident that we won't see the kind of presidential power under the new setup that was characteristic of the old order. So there's that aspect of Becikaid Essebsi's victory and his hand signals greeting this. And once again, 2 Tunisias. This time the red Tunisia is even smaller. That Marzouki actually won more territory, so to speak, than Ennahda did in terms of the distribution of the vote. So this brings into perspective the possibility of the fact that there is, in a way, 2 Tunisias, not only in the electoral sphere, but from other points of view. What was then at issue in the political sphere following Becikaid Essebsi's election as president was the composition of the new government. And one thing that Ennahda made pretty clear is that it was willing to serve in, and this could be seen as code for, we think we should be included in a future government. And for a while, Nida Tunis said nothing about this, and Becikaid Essebsi said nothing about it. And what happened when he appointed Habib Essid, who's really a kind of independent, non-party technocrat sort of figure, is that Essid tried to get a cabinet past the parliament that didn't include Ennahda. And this was vigorously criticized. This is the cabinet he eventually appoints. And he's obliged to bring in Ennahda. And the first attempt, he just had 2 smaller parties, the Union Patriotique Libre, the Free Patriotic Union, which brought 16 seats to add to Nida Tunis's 86, and then another smaller party, centre-right party called Affect Tunis, sort of liberal party, brings in 8. That only gave them 110 seats out of 217. Not enough. Nowhere near enough to last for any length of time. A lot of criticism. And so he then suggests a wider coalition that includes Ennahda with one important ministry and a number of minor junior positions. It's a broader government, as you can see, and it is massively approved. 166 votes out of 217 support this new government on February the 5th. And there's something to be said about this new government. Quite a lot of key positions are given to people who are formally non-party or independent. In fact, of course, they are in a way Fulou. Mostly they're people who have been in the service of the state for a long time in the past. So the interior, defense, justice. Nida Tunis has finance and foreign affairs. Its General Secretary Tayyip Bakouche becoming Minister of Foreign Affairs. Ennahda is given one key ministry, vocational training and employment. And that is, of course, a poison chalice, or a bed of nails, or an opportunity, looking at pessimistically or optimistically. It is a key ministry, given the economic challenges the government needs to rise to. But of course, the price of getting it wrong is going to be high for Ennahda. It's risking a lot. 3 women are in the government. Most ministers are over 50. Okay, I've got a couple of minutes left. change of pace, a statistic to ponder. More foreign fighters joining the Islamic State are from Tunisia than anywhere else. This is a bit of a wake-up call. I'm reverting to the two Tunisias theme here. And the fact that all this time that unavoidably, I'm not criticizing the political class, they had to get through these disagreements and figure things out, a way of handling these disagreements. I think they've done pretty well. And I'm very cheered that civil society came in on the act and its intervention was accepted. I think this is a very healthy state of affairs. It sets some very useful precedents. But the fact is they haven't been able to address the socioeconomic problems at all over these last 4 years. And these problems haven't gone away. And there's a lot of young Tunisians for whom the events of the last 4 years have meant nothing and brought nothing. The turnouts in the elections have been low. We're talking barely over 50%. There's a lot of Tunisians who are not at all involved in the politics of the new Tunisia. And they're looking for other things to get involved in, as you can see. There is a running sore on the border with Algeria around Jebel Shambi, or Mont Shambi, which is here, down here, just southwest of Kasserine, and just near the border across southeast of Tebessa in Algeria. This is bandit country. There's a running sort of saga going on with terrorists, jihadists hold up there, the Tunisian army in action, and not necessarily making a lot of headway and taking quite a lot of hits. So those are elements. But to bring it to an end now, I haven't really gone into the ins and outs of the economic position, partly because I know less about them. As I said at the outset, I certainly don't regard myself as an authority on Tunisia and hope that there are authorities in the audience so that I can learn something, learn something more. But I think that the point here is that we've now got a situation where the constitutional problems have been provisionally sorted. And that means that now the parties have to learn to do something that they haven't known how to do up until now and haven't needed to do, which is actually to handle the economy. None of them have any experience of handling the economy. It's not really easy to say that Ennahda has a developed body of economic thought. It's got, from that point of view, a rather contradictory constituency. And that actually is also true in some degree of Nida Tunis as well, which has basically functioned as a catch-all secular party. If you don't like Ennahda, vote for Nida Tunis. Its general secretary, now its foreign minister, Tayyip Bakush, is someone with left-wing credentials, or social democratic credentials. He's himself a former general secretary of the trade union. Back in the 1980s, he was general secretary of the UGGT at one point for 3 or 4 years. And he has a discourse that is kind of left of center. Plenty of Nida Tunis are well to the right of that. So it's not clear that either of these two parties are going to find it easy to agree on economic policies that are capable of dealing effectively with the challenges. They're constrained by the attitude of would-be international partners, particularly, of course, the IMF, as always, wanting cuts on subsidies and this, that, and the other, sort of thing that is extremely difficult for parties with a social base in the poorer reaches of society to actually sell to their own constituencies. And the odds are, I think, that this government won't last very long. I think if it lasts 18 months, it's doing really rather well. But it is a solution to an immediate conjuncture and the problems of that immediate conjuncture. And it's in line with the deal that was done, the crucial deal that was done in the autumn of 2013. And the question now really is what resources can Tunisia, civil society, and the political class prove that they find that they haven't yet exhibited, that will enable them to cope with the challenges of economic policy should this government actually not succeed, which is in the cards. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. We probably can take the question, but I'll stand over here. Anyone have any comments or questions for Hugh or for anyone else? Please.
I'm wondering to what extent the personalities of the old RCD are effectively sort of holding the fort or practicing form of entryism, you might say that means that they would, for all practical purposes, be the dominant influence in Tunis. A lot of personalities in the new government have ties with the old
Sure.
regime. And to what extent is that a problem?
I haven't found it easy to gauge. Your question, to what extent, I'm not sure what the accurate answer is, because you hear people saying contrary things. Of course, it's a theme of critics. It's a theme of Ennahda critics of Nida Tunis, but also left-wing critics. Sure. Yeah. On the other hand, I think that a certain amount of this discussion is actually ad hominem, in the sense that if your own individual record is not disgraceful, there isn't much against you. There is, it seems to me, an understanding that there should not be a blanket disqualification of people who are members of the RCD. And I happen to agree with that. I think that, the example of Iraq and elsewhere, and Libya, where everyone in the old regime was disqualified from political life. These were not wise decisions.
Egypt, on the other hand, is a sort of counterexample, if you will.
Well, in Egypt, it's the army, isn't it? The army manipulating what part of the old NDP. I personally think that it's a variable. It's an open question. Nida Tunis is a recent growth. Ennahda, of course, isn't. Ennahda has a long history going back to the early 80s, and has been built to last in a way. What would happen if Qaeda Sebsi fell under a bus tomorrow? He's 88. Would Nida Tunis hold together? It's not obvious. Tayyip Bakush is a very able politician as general secretary, but he's 70. 70 is young in this, relatively speaking. I think that it's a provisional catch-all party that could fall apart, and if it does fall apart, then you reassess the situation. I personally think it's a good thing that there are two parties of roughly equal weight in the electoral arena. But this could be a blip. It could be a temporary development. But my impression is that the anathema against people of the ancien regime is not very bitter. And that isn't a big problem. I think a more important problem is how the ex-RCD elements, some of whom, of course, probably almost certainly do have what you suggest, a kind of vision that it's, in a way, their duty to preserve the state, that the preservation of the state under new circumstances is partly precisely the role they need to play. Well, that's a positive side to that. How will they get on with the non-RCD element coming in? How do they negotiate political differences? I don't pretend to know. But that's what they need to do if Nida Tunis is to consolidate as a party with a future. These are just things for us to watch.
Good. So I have, in this order, Ali, Will, Ahmed, Richard. Ali.
First of all, thank you for this wonderful and most penetrating analysis. I had one question, which to some extent I think you alluded to it when you talked about two Tunisias.
Yeah.
But could you maybe say a few words on the appeals of the different political parties and ideologies to different social classes, if you will, or the social base of these in Tunis, including, for example, the youth, if one could talk about the youth as a meaningful single category, but more broadly, to which groups do these parties and ideological orientations behind them that informs their positions appeal to different segments of the Tunisian society?
I'm not sure that it's... My impression is that it's not really very fixed, that there are core constituencies for Ennahda, And they're the ones you'd expect in terms of small business, petty intelligentsia of a more traditional outlook, the pious middle classes. These are cliches. And with particularly well established in the south, as you saw from the map. And of course, Ranouchi is from the south. He's from Gabes, down in the far south, as was his prime ministers and so on. Whereas Nida Tunis clearly has a strong base in the traditional catchment areas of the regime, the Sahel region that has produced so much of Tunisians' elites, Sfax and Monastir and places like this, and of course Tunis itself. But that otherwise, a lot of the apart from the identity divide, Islamist and secular modernist, with clearly Nida Tunis managing to appeal very much to a lot of the secular modernist constituency, the urban middle classes in the north, elements of the working class. And I think it's quite a cunning move by Essebsi to put Bakouche as general secretary of the party. I think there's a lot of fluidity. A variable here is the number of left-wing parties. There was a plethora of them early on, and of course they all fish in the same water. They're all sort of jockeying for their share of a relatively fixed quantum of fish, or whatever metaphor you may allow me to make. I think that they have to be absorbed into the bigger parties in some degree. There needs to be a process of crystallization that might succeed in giving Nida Tunis a fairly solid social democratic wing, and might then the rest of the left eventually crystallizing, though this goes against its nature perhaps, in a more hardline left-wing party outside. But I think, in other words, there are processes here that we can simply watch. But nonetheless, it's striking that even with Ennahda having roots in the south, it's failing to appeal to a lot of people. And I think particularly youth. They're not interested. They haven't been engaged by it. That's my impression. Outside the secular intelligentsia, their youth are engaged in some degree. Maybe we should share perceptions rather than have me flounder around in trying to provide any more of an answer to this. My impression, nonetheless, is that with little more than 50% voting in the elections, there's still a mountain to climb in terms of engaging a large part of the population.
Okay. Will?
Better write them down.
It's very clear that both Nida Tunis and Ennahda, even other parties, perhaps even the UJTK, are in some ways coalitions of multi-solutions,
Mm-hmm.
which with the sense of the Tunisia, always remember colleagues, myself, having lived in Egypt and Algeria, always referred to Tunisia as a mumkin country, a possible place, a place where you could get to the airport with your valise and not be molested seriously, things like that. So I'm not surprised that they would come to this crisis in July and actually look at each other very seriously and examine the context they were living in and say, that's not the way to go, and we're going to do something different. And I have, in that regard, it seems like you rightly put a lot of emphasis on leadership. And sometimes I feel it sounded especially to one individual, whether it's Abbasi, Essebsi, Ranouchi. But I assume there's a sort of cluster of people around each of those leaders that are helpful in various ways
Mm-hmm.
to their point of view. And I thought you laid out pretty well Essebsi's position. You said some very nice things about Abbasi. I'd love to hear more
I'm going to, Will, I'm going to stop you at 1 for a second because I'm cognizant of the clock, but I may do a deal for you a little later that you'll appreciate.
Well,
You can deny me.
this is an entirely valid question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to it. I mean, I visited Ennahda's headquarters when I was in Tunis in June and talked to people there. And of course, the last thing they would be willing to talk frankly to me about was the relative status of Ghannouchi in their organization. My impression, therefore, may be false. I don't have inside knowledge on this. My impression is that he still has a considerable authority, and that what happened, the way that corner was turned successfully in the autumn of 2013, in part was premised on Ghannouchi having the authority to get his party to make that turn. But he may have paid a higher price internally for that than I'm aware of. But you're right. In what is entirely a provisional take of the situation, this is what I've been offering, nothing more than that, as someone who is only recently been focusing on it. I have placed quite a lot of emphasis on the role of competent political leaders, and I think Tunis has been blessed with several competent people all at the same time. But of course, they may be losing ground. There's no guarantee that they will continue to exercise the authority they have. So that makes insofar as the present situation reposes on that premise, it's fragile. I'd love to know what your other questions are. Maybe
we'll come back. If
Sure.
time, or I'll
Sure.
invite him to join us.
Sure.
Ahmed, please.
Yeah, so these are merely for clarification. You mentioned the military ones, and I'm curious to know if you know or if you followed whether they had any more engagement in these developments since the very beginning, and at what level were they consulted? Were they any part of a power struggle or deals that we don't know about? And with that, if you know how the military sort of is engaged in the life of Tunisia.
I'm not.
The other short one is the economy. If you can also clarify for me a bit more, what is the base of the economy in Tunisia? Is it more of a tourism, agriculture? What constitutes the major sort of economic
The economy relies on a number of different things. I mean, there's a substantial manufacturing sector, but which has been suffering a bit. Tourism, of course, has been suffering over the last 4 years, and that's a well-developed sector, but it's been depressed. There's some mining, and there's important mining in the south, at Gafsa in particular, and Gafsa was the source of unrest in 2008 that in a way prefigured the uprising in 2010. And agriculture along the periphery, that's to say that from the center of the country, west and south, is undercapitalized and subject also to, I mean, there's a number of different complaints, but there's a general perception of self-serving government interference with agriculture rather than effective support for it. But here I'm just really reporting other people's views. I can't pretend to have made my own study of these matters. Where the army is concerned, it's something I didn't follow up when I was in Tunisia. I was making perhaps a questionable assumption that the army really wasn't a major player in the politics. That the army is a sort of constant of the state, like as in any state, but that its moment of truth was in January 2011, and that for historically explicable reasons, understandable reasons, it is not a politically ambitious army, and it hasn't changed since 2011. There have been arguments. I'm not sure that I've understood them all. There's arguments that led to the resignation of the Chief of Staff in 2013. I'm not entirely certain that I know the truth of that story, why Ben Ammar, whom I mentioned early on as the man who said, I'm not slaughtering the people, why he then bowed out later. But the point here is that the army has always been secondary in Tunisia. It's the exact opposite of Algeria's army in terms of its role in the power structure and the political game. And I don't see that changing, unless the security situation really, really develops in an alarming way. It's It's being contained at the moment, and here one needs to factor in the rest of the region, of course. And one positive factor here that I was going to mention was Algeria's cooperation with Tunisia on the security angle. And not only on the security angle, also in relation to internal conflicts. The Algerians have had a supportive attitude. And I think if the security cooperation remains effective, the Tunisian army's role probably won't change significantly. But those are ifs.
Okay, Richard, please.
Well, I do think, well, first of all, let me say, I'm not a Tunisian hand by any stretch. So I happened to be in Tunisia in July and August 2013, right after the assassination
Right.
of Mohammed Bustani. I was astounded at how relatively calm the situation was, how civil it was. I mean, there were demonstrations, and things that were wrong. But in contrast to a place like Egypt, I mean, it was remarkable. Really remarkable. And of course, it wasn't hard to find people critical of the Zafta and so on. But it was done with a level of civility that was just mind-blowing for anybody who spent any time eastward, just an observation. But the business of the army and the fact that it's not a Victorian institution is remarkable. Do you have any historical insight as to how this was maintained over time? I mean, of course, the struggle came largely out of the labor movement, I gather, against the French and so on. But do you have any insights as to how this objective subordination of the army to political authority has been sustained over the course of decades? Because in the region, it's remarkable.
It is remarkable. I entirely agree with you. It's remarkable, and it's a fundamental fact. I've seen this as a fundamental structural premise of the Tunisian story, not alone, not on its own, but one to be factored in right at the beginning, particularly exploring the difference with Egypt. My understanding of this is this, that in Tunisia, you really had one-party rule. It was the party that was the source of power. It was the party that secured independence. It's the party that was the institutional instrument of the interface of the relationship between the independent state and the rest of society. And it was the party that orchestrates the various details and ramifications of that interrelationship. And to do that needs, in part, to co-opt, in some degree, at any rate, the trade union. It's a strategic need of the RCD and the neo-Distor before it. But that a corollary of this is the political marginalization of the army. And if you ask yourself, why could it sustain this? Because I think it was in the nature of the original setup in '56. When Tunisia becomes independent, it's the neo-Distor that Bourguiba has founded in 1934 and led to success over the next 22 years that takes power. Why does it manage to avoid what, after all, other political parties in the Arab world fall prey to, namely the eventual takeover of the party by the military wing of the Ba'ath in Syria? Hassan al-Bakr and so on in Iraq. And I think that that's to do with the fact that Tunisia is so virtually homogenous. There is no major part of Tunisian society that risks putting in doubt, in question, the whole. Of course, this is totally different from the situation in Iraq and arguably different also from Syria. Tunisians, there's no real identity difference between them. They're all Arabs, they're Arabo-Muslim, and there's no the Berber element is a kind of just a little curiosity down in the south, and it's not politically significant, really. The only identity element is one they, in a sense, have to derive from ideology rather than from the clearly different languages or whatever of the elements of the population. So I think that means that the regime has never needed an army for internal repression. It's never needed an army to hold an otherwise problematical nation state together. Tunisia is a kind of natural nation state. It's found it easy to evolve into the mold of the l'État-nation. And so it hasn't needed an army, and it hasn't felt really threatened from the outside either. So that's how I would at least provisionally go about explaining why a situation that existed in 56 could be sustained thereafter with the army permanently secondary, and perhaps a little resentful and not prepared to sacrifice itself for that system, but without any real ambitions of its own, without a political repertoire of its own.
Never having to fight a war of any
Yeah,
period.
yeah.
One last question, please.
It's actually kind of a comment to this kind of the situation with the army. I'm not sure how significant it is, but there was a citizen from Tunisia 2 months ago that was slandering the military, and he was actually tried in a military trial, which is very bizarre and goes against like human rights convention. So the Tunisian military is kind of, we'll see how it plays out. It's just kind of an isolated incident, but it is interesting that they're starting to get politically involved after these elections have happened.
Yeah, I agree with you. That incident is, it goes against the grain of what I was presenting as the main dynamic. I agree with you. It's something to just bear in mind. So there may well, in fact, under the surface, be a degree of fluidity even within the army, and that could impact on the behavior of needed Tunis ministers of justice, for instance, or whatever it was. You could envisage some sort of countercurrents that lead to things like this. He was a blogger, as I understood it, wasn't it? And he insulted the army, or was seen as having insulted the army, and someone somewhere decided to make an issue of it.
Social media, which is very odd because media is being completely deregulated in Tunisia. It's very odd.
It is an odd story. So it's useful to bear that in mind. The situation is not a smooth one.
Good. So, being a generous dictator, Will, I've got to come back to allow you one more. And then I want to invite you to dinner to join us afterwards. Okay, so you can ask the third one at dinner. Behavior is not important. Please.
Okay. Just regarding your army, of course, it probably also matters that Groupiba consistently kept it small,
Sure.
kept its budget,
Yeah.
and never allowed the kind of political action or economic action that we see in neighboring Arab countries sometimes when it comes to the army. Another point about the army that might be worth throwing into the hat at this point. Tunisian army at the moment has been called on to do some new tasks that are pretty serious, especially along the Libyan border. And the cooperation with Algeria, I think, in part, is a product of their mutual concern for the spread of arms, militias, radical groups, and so on,
Sure.
using Libya.
Sure.
And this is really complicated even in the terms of Tunisian peripheral politics, because there are many tribal groups or social groups in general along the frontiers, west and east, that have for a long time thrived on the unofficial budgets of cross-border passage of goods, which is now being interdicted more seriously because the goods are now no longer benign like soap and appliances. They're now weapons, they're now munitions, explosives, and so on. So the army now has a duty to get involved in that sort of stuff. Responsibility. So my guess is its role may be changing somewhat in the light of that.
Could do. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
I was wondering.
Oh, no, third one is dinner. You have only, No. So, Hugh, if this is you nibbling on the margins of a country, I must say that's a nice, tasty nibble. It's a wonderful, wonderful talk as always. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
for
Thank you.
Some of you are coming to dinner. We have a van downstairs, Heidi, out here. We will take you to dinner. We will bring you back